All right, so starting now. Thank you, John Tay, Dr. Tay, for inviting me to the 2020 Cannabis Summit. There are lots of interesting things to be spoken of that will greatly benefit the health of Australians and anyone else who wants to listen to a new understanding of basic principles of life that have profound effects with respect to the medicines we use and the health we hope to achieve. So we're going to start off with some basic physical truths that are not typically understood by most people because we're not properly educated as to what life is and its origins and relationships to physics. So the first fact that I'd like to make sure we're all on the same page is that flowing energy organizes matter to create flow-dependent structures. So what's a flow-dependent structure? The easiest way to understand that is to think of a whirlpool in a bathtub. When you first pull the plug, the water randomly moves down the drain. But as time proceeds, you get a whirlpool. So think of what really happened there. Thousands and thousands of molecules spontaneously organized themselves to form that whirlpool. What I'm telling you, therefore, is that it's a natural process for molecules to cooperate, as long as in doing so, they dissipate potential more rapidly than if they didn't cooperate. So in this case here, we see molecules cooperating so they can dissipate gravitational potential. So we have trillions and trillions forming that whirlpool for the sole purpose of being able to get the water out of the tub quicker. The same thing happens with other forms of potential. With chemical potential, we can form lasers. Those are coherent forms of light. Life is also a coherent form of biochemical flow. So flow-dependent structure in life is not driven by gravity, but driven by chemical potential, which ultimately really goes back to the sun. So all flow-dependent structures result in a dynamic balance of opposing forces and their associated flows. What that's telling you in simple terms is that life, all life, is a function of flowing energy and mass. And that when that occurs successfully, we grow and we become healthy. And when that interaction is decaying over time, the quality of the accumulation in your life bank is going bankrupt, that's aging and illness. And we'll address those from fundamental physical chemical perspectives that show us that we've been doing very wrong things for a long time and that we can very simply reverse so many bad habits and change dramatically our normal perspective of life and health. So all living systems are high-level flow-dependent structures. We're dynamic, adaptive fractals, dead but organized matter that underwent the far from equilibrium phase change to living state of matter. To best understand these concepts, think of yourself and make a clone of one instant of yourself in time. So that clone is now dead, but it's got all of the exact locations that the live you had at one instant of time. What's the difference? Now let's take the cloned you that's dead and clone you again. And this time we'll dissociate all the molecules in the new cloned you and put them in a bag. So now we have three of you. We have the live you, the snapshot that no longer has time, and the fully randomized you that no longer has the information to put the pieces in place, nor the ability to activate them into life. Learn those differences. One is no information, one is static information, which is negative entropy, and the other is dynamic information, life. Okay. Living systems must always balance the energy that drives adaptation with the intrinsic waste, entropy, that is produced in the process. In other words, there's always friction. And the friction of our living systems is manifest really as our heat. That's why your head is hot all the time. It's cranking out so much energy. It's using so much. And we got to get rid of that heat or the system would be disrupted by having too much heat. Aging is the systemic accumulation of dynamic entropy in everyone's idiosyncratic, time-dependent biochemical evolution. Well, what we'd like to be doing is minimizing that entropy production while we maximize negative entropy, information, our health. The cannabinoid system can be regulated to produce anti-aging results in the biochemical flow of living human systems. This is profound. I'm going to be 73 years old in another month, and I've reversed a number of nasty conditions by applying these principles. And in this video, we're going to show you a very dramatic example of why COVID and other viral infections can be trivially controlled so that you become immune and do not have a problem with the symptoms during the infection. It's all very possible, and it's true for every virus that's been applied to that I've been involved with, ranging from HIV, COVID, flu, papilloma, herpes viruses in general. So let's look at what's really going on. Energy source matters. This was my joke on Black Lives Matter, because energy sources do really matter. The cell's electron transport system is the equivalent of a nuclear reactor in a society. Both produce free radicals, life as a byproduct of powering homeostatic complexity. So the benefits that come from a nuclear reactor is that it produces heat in a very efficient fashion. The problem is it's very dangerous if there's any kind of lack of control of the underlying source. And in a very similar fashion, mitochondria are producing energy, but instead of by producing heat directly, they produce controlled chemical reactions that create essentially negative entropy, organization, as long as the flow is occurring. Both systems require constant preventative and repair maintenance in order to minimize any potential catastrophe. You know, if you don't repair your society, if you don't have garbage collection, if you don't rebuild your bridges, and likewise, if we don't do similar things within our body, then the system, us, collapses. The mitochondria produce free radicals by virtue of the chemical reactions. And those free radicals that are produced are the same free radicals that radiation produces when it splits water. So what I want to do now is show you a video of a dear friend of mine, Danica from Belgrade, and she's had horrible trouble her whole life with breathing difficulties as a result of premature birth. So asthma, allergies, COPD were normal, very problematic aspects of her life from birth. And again, I want to define health as the distance from equilibrium when we're looking at chemical reactions. It's that distance and the accumulated knowledge of the flow that accounts for, when sustainable, our lifespan. So carbohydrates and protein catabolism, meaning metabolism that generates energy, that breaks them down, can optimally feed a cell's electron transport system for efficient energy production. So we have the ability to use very efficient means of energy production, just like that nuclear reactor. But you don't want to mess it up, because just like the nuclear reactor, big problems. It drives the living system into the future. This is what a new thought, that the flowing energy actually creates novelty in the patterns of our biochemistry, as well as actually in our DNA and our genetics. That's the story we'll get into separately. But the point of it is that we live in an illusion that DNA controls everything, when in fact it's metabolism that's responsible for everything, including the DNA. Any imbalance in the metabolic flow will result in increased production of free radicals by the mitochondrial electron transport system. The energetic consequences is that the energy producing pathways produce an excess of free radicals. There will be net damage because free radicals are going to react with your protein, your DNA, your RNA, your fats. Everything can be chemically modified by these highly reactive chemical species. So the energetic consequence is that when energy producing pathways produce an excess of free radicals, there will be net damage. Redox imbalance becomes unsustainable. The cell's flow dependent structures required for viability collapse. For example, when your neurons collapse, you generate Alzheimer's, created by inappropriate flows, created by the accumulation of damages that in a holistic way bring the system closer to equilibrium. Biochemical evolution of species is flow-dependent complexity pushed to higher levels by excess energy availability of the complexity seen in invertebrates. The excess flow driven by excess food availability and consumption promotes instability. And the instability has a creative nature. You know, think of religions. Man is created in God's image. What does that mean? Flowing creativity. The flow is everywhere in the universe. The flow creates everything. The flow is God. Generalized open system dynamics, GOD. So emergence of vertebrates was driven by excess flow generating stability. We needed to organize to higher levels of complexity, and vertebrates emerged with the ability to have extra adaptation as seen in our minds and in our immune systems. You know, your mind regulates, monitors all information that flows into the system. Only two things flow into any living system: information that your senses monitor, and mass that your immune system monitors. That's it. So both of those systems are intrinsically regulated by endocannabinoids as a function of how they regulate the flow of energy. CB1 receptor regulates the electron transport system to allow it to more efficiently operate and push creativity on all meanings: mental, physical, new species. So what I want to show you now is my dear Danitza, who was born prematurely with undeveloped lungs and had suffered her whole life from asthma, COPD, and severe allergies. A few years ago, we discovered that the combination of CBD and NAC has a very profound effect on these types of respiratory allergic conditions. So extreme that she forgot of her lifelong torment with respiratory problems, and for years became quite normal in her respiratory capacity, other than a lot of coughing. So what happened was she ran out of NAC, N-acetylcysteine, which is not readily available in Serbia. And as a consequence, she became severely ill and almost died. So I'm going to show you the significance of all of that. I had shipped it to her. 3 kilograms were on the way in the mail, but because of the COVID delay, it didn't get there. And on 4/20, her birthday, she was in the backyard, again, having forgotten how dangerous allergies can be for her. And that night when she went home, went into her house, she locked up and would have died. So watch the video and understand how important it is to regulate your metabolism to completely control COVID and other viral infections, even in the most susceptible individuals. There is no need for lockdown, no need for masks, no need for vaccinations, only intelligence so that you can understand the nature of the flow and how to regulate it for health. My dear Danitza was born prematurely and has suffered from severe lung complications her entire life. As a child, her lips would turn blue, and she was frequently sent to the mountains or the beaches in order to try and aid her breathing. So I sent her a total of 3 kilograms in 2 shipments. Unfortunately, the mails were delayed and she didn't have any. She had forgotten over the years of feeling so good how bad her lungs really were. So she was outside enjoying a spring day on her birthday, which happens ironically to be 420, when she completely... In this video, she is literally dying because she things got worse from what you see in the video. Reached the point where she called the ambulance and they wouldn't come because she didn't have COVID. Thankfully, I realized the solution. The translation of her words is that she's dying and people should pray for her. Thankfully, the outcome was different because we had a solution. She took THC oil, put it between her fingers, and warmed it up while she pressed up on her nostrils to open her. It works. So what I find extremely frustrating is in 1997, a paper came out where they did a very intelligent experiment in northern Italy where people were dying from H1N1, the same area where people were dying at extraordinary rates during this current COVID situation. In that experiment, they gave NAC out to people in 20 centers, typically people who were in danger because of various conditions. And they looked at what happened at the end of the year. So this is a great experiment because it's real world. You're seeing what happens on the people living their normal lives. And the results were profound. 79% of the people who didn't take NAC had symptomatic infections ranging from death to minor infections. Of the people who took NAC, only 25% of the people had any symptoms. This eliminates the whole problem that has shut down and destroyed the economies and the livelihoods of millions and millions of people because of the inability of the experts to understand the physics of life, and even worse, to read their own scientific literature and to be able to use some logic and extend knowledge to a very practical outcome to save many, many lives. If you look at the numbers here, you can see that for a relatively small amount of money compared to what's spent on vaccine development and all the nonsense we've heard, everybody in America would have been protected. This is the failure of the biomedical system, which designs drugs to treat symptoms, not the symptoms like dying from COVID, but typically the trivial symptoms that they're trying to suppress, your runny nose or this pain or that pain. They're not treating you to promote health. With the amount of money using NAC, especially if in addition CBD and vitamin D were administered, we would have an entirely different world with healthy people. There are simple thematic truths that underlie all living systems. All life and its dynamic manifestations are flow-dependent structures. It's just like that whirlpool I described. All flow-dependent structures are dependent on extracting free energy and negative entropy from the environment in order to maintain their dynamic structure. That's why we eat, breathe, get rid of our wastes, but don't just sit there doing nothing. We live, we experience flow, constant adaptation. All living systems are flowing dynamic balance between metabolism that powers differentiated functions and cell division. Carbohydrate and amino acids are responsible. And the repair of free radical induced biochemical changes as a result of autophagy, fat burning, beta oxidation. All of that's driven by the CB2 receptor. The CB1 drives carbohydrate, cell division, and differentiation, but must be balanced with repair. CB2 activity, fat burning. That's not hard to understand. The implications are profound for everything we know and do having to do with life. Life is a dynamic fractal that constantly self-adapts in order to balance damaging metabolism that brings the system closer to equilibrium, illness, death. Every time you change your environment. So you're no longer adapted to the environment that you originally changed for. And this is true of the interactions of the cumulative individuals that create populations, species, interactions, and all the flow of life and energy on the planet is occurring in the same fashion. Life is a dynamic fractal that constantly self-adapts in order to balance damaging metabolism that brings the system closer to equilibrium, illness and death. Health is distance from equilibrium. A viral infected cell, unlike an individual isolated viral particle, is a living system. All viruses redirect metabolic flow. And in doing that, they're perturbing the flow, hence generating free radicals and all of their damaging consequences. So again, this is kind of a repeat here, but I want to emphasize. So typically we have activation of things with calcium. We see that in muscles, nerves, hormones, immune system. And on the other hand, we have deactivation by calcium. And that is actually when we deposit bones, when we turn on fat burning. The calcium leaves the plasma in the blood, so we deactivate things while it gets deposited back into the bones. And if everything's in harmony, we have a natural back and forth as we respond on a subcellular, cellular, tissue, and whole body level. It's the same dynamic interactions creating everything. So we create damages when we're burning our carbs and our proteins to make ourselves ready and push us into the future. And we prevent it with antioxidants, and we're focusing on one, glutathione and NAC. Glutathione is the major antioxidant in your lungs and in your body. And your lungs are loaded with pro-oxidant activity. Well, the oxygen's coming in. So glutathione works one time and quenches essentially the equivalent of one redox reaction. Sulfhydryl groups keep proteins in the proper shape. You know, if you had like a long structure and you had a sulfhydryl here and here, they could attach together and thereby shape the loop of a protein, for example, right? So when they're reduced, they're in when they're reduced, they're separate. And when they're oxidized, they come together. So certain things need to be oxidized to maintain structure, like proteins in your blood. And other things are best kept apart because that's the nature of their structure. So where I'm getting at is redox balance is critical, and that we have to constantly recharge our glutathione with NAC so that we can prevent free radicals and have the appropriate balance between creating damages and fixing damages, between cellular construction with the electron transport system, aerobic glycolysis, glutaminolysis, all of those energy sources, as opposed to the reconstruction energy source that's fostered by the CB2 receptor. So we have a balance between CB1 activity and CB2 activity. This is the miracle of cannabis. It regulates both sides of the flow that give us life. Pretty important. And it's responsible for the evolution of the human brain by pushing the need for higher levels of complexity, as initially shown by the evolution of the CB1 receptor from modifying earlier receptors. And subsequently, millions of years later, after the flow was increasing complexity and now was again out of balance, generating too many free radicals, the system did some gene duplication and created a new solution. CB2 receptor to turn on fat burning so you could recycle the problems you were creating by having too much energy efficiently flowing from the electron transport system via the CB1 receptor. Doesn't that all make sense? I hope so. It does to me. Trust me, it makes sense. I've got 30,000 peer-reviewed articles that look at all fields. This is always the answer. So let's look now at something very, very important and of concern to everyone, since it's affected all of us, the coronavirus infection. When a virus infects a cell, it's the same as when a cell decides to go from a resting state to either divide or becoming a differentiated state cell. It's got to up its flow to make the things needed. In the case of a dividing cell, it's got to make all the goodies for the division. In the case of a virally infected cell, it's got to make all of the pieces. So as it's doing that, it's creating an imbalance. It's taking over the flow of what should have been a healthy, happy cell. And when it takes over that flow, it generates perturbations, free radicals. So the electron transport system gets shut off as a consequence of feedback from changes caused by free radicals. And aerobic glycolysis, glutaminolysis, and a variety of feeds that go into the electron, into the Krebs cycle, which can then do different things. It's the central metabolic mill of all living systems. So what we want to look at now is how that flow is influenced by this balance of carbohydrate and its protective modes, aerobic glycolysis and glutaminolysis, with additional extensions that I don't want to go into because it's just more complicated. Hopefully you get the idea, versus our fat burning story. And this permeates all aspects of our life. And it came from an early time, actually predating the CB1 and CB2 receptors that first appeared with the emergence of vertebrates. And what we have are cannabinoid chemistry without receptors, you know, the lipid metabolites that are characteristic of the endocannabinoid system, things that bind to vanilloid receptors and other aspects of energy production, et cetera, were all in play prior to the CB1 receptor. But it was only with that extra flow that the necessary rearrangements occurred. So what I want you to understand is that we have a system called the Renin-Angiotensin System, and that our CB1 receptor really emerged from a receptor that was regulating water balances, okay? And this was our angiotensin system, our Renin-Angiotensin System, very involved with, again, water balance and your kidneys. And what happens is that system regulates your blood pressure, your clotability, all sorts of things by balancing the stimulatory activity of neurons, because it's your neurons that are telling your muscles to contract, it's your neurons that are telling your hormones to be secreted or produced. You know, this whole web of flow kind of focuses through the very efficient, rapid communication of the nervous system. Excuse me. So it turns out that most of our nerves are turning things on, but there's a whole set of nerves that turn down those stimulatory nerves so that they don't overload with free radicals. This is part of the balancing acts that we see the cannabinoid system involved with, where when a nerve stimulates a downstream neuron, that activity winds up generating free radicals, which then have the downstream neuron break some of its membrane to generate endocannabinoids that then go backwards across the gradient to the upstream neuron, where they bind to CB1 receptors and CB, you know, it's mostly CB1 receptors, and inhibit the flow via modulating the channels again, so that we have a feedback loop where we don't overly stimulate the downstream neuron and where we don't overly stimulate the upstream neuron by producing the neurotransmitter. So most neurotransmitters, like glutamine, for example, it's known as an excitotoxin, because the continuous stimulation by the upstream neuron of the downstream neuron will generate too many free radicals and can cause cell death. That's how you wind up having apoptosis, leading to, for example, Alzheimer's and the other forms of dementia. It's just different pathways, different patterns that are doing the same thing. So back here again, where were we? All metabolism works on the absolute need to balance opposing forces. Lethal respiratory infections, as well as chemical inhalation, cause free radical dependent development of ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, where the cells die, they leak their contents, you drown in your cellular fluid would be one example. Alternatively, you can have a massive immune response that brings in the weaponry. You know, some of our immune cells make free radicals to use them like little ray guns to kill viruses and infected cells. Well, if that's out of hand, then you generate massive apoptosis and you have your lungs basically die. Hence, we have the inflammation that's causing the cell deaths, but it extends beyond that because the angiotensin system was an early evolutionary advancement. So all of your blood vessels aligned with angiotensin receptors, your brain, your nervous cells, they're everywhere. They're a very primitive system for metabolic balance involving glutamine metabolism, which is the main thing that cannabinoids often wind up counteracting. Again, this balance through the layers of complexity. So where I want to go with this is that we can see it best, I think, in the next slide. So here we have our coronavirus infection, and we have our classical Renin-Angiotensin system, which has a bunch of components, angiotensin 1, angiotensin 2, and they go to appropriate receptors. This is all on the sugar burning side of things, okay? And they have their roles because you need to increase your blood pressure at certain times, and you need to have blood clotting, for example, with an injury. So under those circumstances, you want that pro-inflammatory tightening of your blood vessels, you know, you want to stop the bleeding, etc. But on the other hand, too much of that is no good. So over evolutionary time, alternatives were squeezed out of the flow. And angiotensin 1 breaks down the peptide. Angiotensin 1 is produced from renin by breaking it down. It's a proteolytic action. You're making a smaller piece of protein. And then ACE2, the angiotensin converting enzyme, does that again, and it generates a peptide 1 through 8, it's known, 8 peptides, 8 amino acids long, okay? And then similarly, the angiotensin converting enzyme can convert to angiotensin 2, which has its own receptors that typically are pro-inflammatory, except for this one, maybe in the nerve cells, maybe anti-inflammatory, depending on how it's all set up. So we see, though, that these breakdown products produce products that activate this receptor, which in turn blocks the problems. These are all pro-inflammatory. These are all anti-inflammatory. This is all supported by carbohydrate metabolism. This is all supported by fat burning. So when you take your CBD and your vitamin D, you shift this way, and the evolutionarily developed complexity designed to protect you can work. What are the consequences? Reduced COVID receptors, reduced inflammation, the reduced inflammatory arm of the immune system. The cardiovascular system isn't going to lock up. Your nerve cells are not going to be lost and not functioning properly. COVID, dizziness, right? This here pertains to the Kawasaki syndrome that many people were dying from. Viral susceptibility, in particular from this virus, is a function of your metabolic balance. If you're overweight, you're going to be susceptible because it's telling you that you made too much fat because you ate too many carbs. This is not hard to understand. When I had the viral infection, as indicated by diarrhea, shortness of breath, runny nose, early on, very early on, all I did was eat more cannabis and take more NAC. And you completely control it. You can feel when you can't breathe. dissolve some NAC in water, drink a little bit more, you'll open up again. And do that while you're taking large amounts of CBD, vitamin D, NAC. Control your flow. I went out, normally I don't AFib anymore at all. I've fixed all of that. But for the 3 days when I didn't feel right and I had all these symptoms, my heart went out as well. And as soon as I felt better again and normal, these symptoms were trivial. But the most obvious one was my AFib in my heart. And as soon as I got back to feeling normal, the AFib was also gone. So I would be a serious candidate, right? Heart disease, old age, it was nothing. Danitza, asthma, COPD, allergies, almost died from lack of NAC. Has the viral infection a couple of months later, it's nothing. Wake up, people, you've been screwed with ignorance and fear. Time to wake up, time to end the lockdown, time to create a schism between people who want natural medicines that go to the root of the problem, your flow, so that you can correct it, as opposed to hiding the imbalances that are killing you with aging and age-related diseases. It's time for a big transition. The planet is undergoing a far from equilibrium phase change. We are one big chemistry set. We are nothing but chemical reactions in the big chemistry set of the planet Earth.